Hi, my name is Todd Strader. I am the founder of a Facebook group called C3M, Cohort of Chronically Concussed Mortarmen. That group, since I went live with the group a little over a month ago, has the better part of 1,000 members who are all interested in the neurological effects of firing heavy mortars during their enlistment and the possible consequences of it, and how to learn more about it. Also, in conjunction with this video, there's another video I made called Occupational Exposure to Low-Level Blast Exposure Firing Heavy Mortars. It's about a 10-minute video, and it's a very good visual demonstration of what I'm going to present to you today, which is the science behind it all. Reading the actual scientific articles and sort of and their findings. But reading the research and the science and the evidence is one thing. Seeing a visual demonstration of it is another, and that's why it's important to watch the accompanying video to this one. So what I'm going to be doing today basically is the sum of all my research since this began. If you want to know a little bit more about me, you can watch the introduction to C3M video I made, which talks about a little bit about myself and how I got to create the group and why I've learned what I have and how I got here, basically, if you're interested. So my goal here today is to make the case for occupational exposure to low-level blast overpressure from firing heavy mortars and VA service connection to veterans with chronic post-concussive symptoms and subsequent neurodegenerative diseases from blast exposure. Okay, I'm going to show that recent science in the last few years has uncovered that soldiers receive unsafe levels of blast overpressure in combat, but also in training, firing heavy weapons like a mortar. So we'll show you that. We're also going to show that mortars are a member of this cohort of soldiers that receive these heavy exposures, and not only a member of this cohort, but actually among the groups that receive the highest cumulative exposures. Also going to show that these occupational exposures can cause brain damage down to even a molecular level, interrupting the way your DNA and genes express themselves. So the damage can be permanent, cumulative, and wide-ranging, obviously. We're also going to show that these cumulative exposures can cause chronic post-concussive syndrome type symptoms. These symptoms can be risk factors leading to other neurodegenerative diseases such as CTE, Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, etc. Basically, that's what we're going to highlight. Then I'll wrap up kind of summarizing everything and re-highlighting. But basically, it's all going to start around this bunch of research I've compiled here. And I'll start with some press releases to kind of introduce what's going on. And then what's going on was basically found out by a scientific study that came out in 2018, where it made people aware of what's going on. And we'll go into the science behind that study and show you without a doubt that exposure to these blast overpressures is obviously service connected for veterans, mortarmen who have complaints of chronic post-concussive symptoms or other neurological or auditory health issues. So we'll go ahead and get started. Before we do, this is going to be basically a feature-length video, so get comfortable, get some popcorn, put your thinking cap on. Some of the verbiage is going to be scientific, so it's dull and I have a hard time pronouncing it, but I'm just going to plow through it. And if you want to reread it again, you can rewind, or you can see the name of the article and find it yourself. But just going to try to plow through things. I'll have some commentary, but I'm going to try to keep it down to a minimum and just let the science and the literature and research speak for itself. Okay, so we'll go ahead and get this started. Introduction. The case for occupational exposure to low-level blast overpressure, firing heavy mortars, and service connection to veterans with chronic post-concussion symptoms and subsequent neurodegenerative diseases. So what I'm going to do next is I'm going to start with some press releases. These are things I've found on the internet from various journalistic websites on the subject. Alright, so the first one we have here is from Science Daily, Science News. Blast overpressure is generated from the firing of weapons and may cause brain damage. This is January 2019 from the University of Gothenburg in Sweden. Their summary. Blast overpressure is generated from the firing of weapons and may cause brain injury. The brain may be injured by noise which is produced when, for example, an anti-tank weapon, bazooka, Carl Gustav, or a howitzer, haubitz, also mortars, is fired. Scientists have demonstrated mild injury to brain tissue. Okay. Scientists at the Salenska Academy demonstrated mild injury to brain tissue. Soldiers have symptoms of disorders of memory, mental processes, emotion, sleep, speech, vision, and hearing. The symptoms may be similar to those of post-traumatic stress syndrome, which may be caused by factors other than combat experience. Also describes post-concussion syndrome, which is what I hypothesize is more accurate diagnosis. And why is because a lot of the mortarmen complain of headaches as well, which is separate from post-traumatic stress syndrome. Findings. The brain may be affected by the blast, which is generated during firing of heavy weapons. The noise produced by the firing of both haubitz, artillery's mortar, and the anti-tank weapon exceeds the occupational standards for the highest levels of blast exposure. The scientists found that the maximum peak levels of the blast were unexpectedly high in the brain. Blast overpressure may result in hemorrhages in the brain. The microscopic examination of the brain showed that the blast from certain weapons produces small hemorrhages, bleeding in the brain tissue and the meninges lining of the brain. Forgive my pronunciation here. Okay. Swedish armed forces have restricted their safety regulations. In summary, the study shows that maximum peak levels of blast generated by the firing of certain weapons led to a small but measurable effect on the brains of pigs and rats. The study also showed this effect on the brain becomes worse with increasing maximum peak blast levels. The results poses the question as to whether exposure to even lower levels of blasts than previous thought injurious might be contributing to large numbers of mild traumatic brain injuries in American military personnel. Alright, next article. Let's see if we can get this lined up here. Alright, this is from policeone.com, August 2016. Protect your team by tracking blast exposure. The blast gauge system provides critical information about blast overpressure to help reduce the risk of traumatic brain injury. While the effects are not well understood, recent studies show that cumulative blast exposure, even to low levels, poses an occupational hazard to soldiers, SWAT officers, and explosive breachers. Black Box Biometrics offers a tool that measures blast exposure to help an operator decide when medical intervention is needed. The wearable blast gauge system provides immediate data to guide, triage, and aid in reducing the risk of blast-related injuries, particularly traumatic brain injury. This is the blast gauge system. And remember this because we're going to see this again here in this
bit of work we got here. But we have basically this to thank for knowing what we know now and introducing the world to the problem of what's happening. Onward, from the same article. Emerging research suggests that repetitive blast exposure may accelerate the brain aging process, causing subtle changes that lead to cognitive decline, said Dr. Bazarian, physician and professor of emergency medicine and physical medicine at the University of Rochester Medical Center. The closer an operator is to the blast, the higher the overpressure he or she will absorb. For example, a flashbang in a small room can register 9 to 10 psi, and 5 psi is enough to rupture an eardrum. We're going to talk about this scientist named Kamimori, and we're going to show you that this range of psi is easily within what mortar crews are exposed to throughout their whole enlistment, and sometimes can be exposed to hundreds, even thousands of times. All right. Routine exposure to blast shock waves during training and operations poses a significant occupational hazard for tactical officers and breachers. Even low-level blast exposure can be harmful, and it's important to monitor officers' exposure. Okay? This is a December 2016 article from NPR. Might have heard of them. Pentagon shelves blast gauges meant to detect battlefield brain injuries. So that's what we just talked about here. The Pentagon says, basically says, yeah, these are great, but they're not what we were looking for, so we're not going to need them anymore. But the story doesn't end for them there. Okay, so this is an NPR story, 2016. All right, here's a good example of what the blast gauge looks like on the back of the soldier's helmet here. Okay, NPR has learned the monitoring was discontinued because the gauges failed to reliably show whether service members have been close enough to an explosion to have sustained a concussion or mild traumatic brain injury. DoD was only seeking information about single blast events like IED or rocket attack, things like that. All right, but the small wearable devices did produce a trove of data on blast exposure that could eventually have helped researchers understand the links between bomb blasts, concussions, and brain diseases. They produced evidence that many service members are exposed to worrisome levels of blast pressure simply by being near heavy weapon when it's fired. Having data from blast sensors could play a very, very important role in helping us understand why an individual has negative effects from a concussion, or why an individual develops the neurodegenerative diseases that seem connected with concussion, everything from ALS to Parkinson's to dementia and even Alzheimer's. All right, he goes on. Kyle Sims was a Special Forces medic who helped deploy the gauges in Afghanistan. He remembers the first time he saw the gauges help a soldier. Oddly, the soldier hadn't been anywhere near a bomb blast. Okay. He was a soldier who fired a shoulder-fired rocket, Sims says, and that shoulder-fired rocket actually gave him a pretty significant overpressure exposure just because he was firing it from a bit of a confined space. Remember confined space. We're going to hit that later, too. When the soldier returned from his mission, he said he had a headache. Sims says the medic checks his gauges, sees that he's got an exposure, takes him over to the hospital, gets a good neuro exam, and then he gets diagnosed with a concussion. So this soldier's brain had taken a hit just from firing his own weapon, says this Special Forces medic who helped test the devices. As researchers began looking at the data from the gauges, it became clear the sort of exposure Sims had witnessed was pretty common. A service member on the training range may experience 30 to 300 exposures per day, multiple days per week. And research in the past few years suggests that lots of small blows to the head can add up. It's just like the NFL, Sims says. the more they look at it, the more they realize it's not the one time the guy gets knocked out on the field. It's the 200 times that he got hit hard enough to have an injury, but not symptomatic enough where he had to be removed from play or didn't go to sick call. All right, so next we have a 2018 article on Navy.mil site. Chronic exposure to low-level blast waves may increase risk of concussion. From the Naval Health Research Center, Public Affairs. And this is hooty what I've already told you. Most research on military TBI to date has focused on injuries resulting from single trauma, single big event, such as an IED or motor vehicle crash. But few studies have examined the relationship between chronic exposure to low-level blast waves, also referred to as overpressure exposure, and the development of TBI. One potential risk factor is the chronic low-level overpressure exposure, such as firing heavy-caliber weapons, which certain service members experience as part of their regular job-related duties. When service members are near a heavy-caliber weapon being fired or an explosive detonating, they are subject to a blast overpressure wave. All right. We also found that Marines whose concussions were associated with blast experience significantly more symptoms than Marines who report a concussion from another cause. Blast-related mild TBIs may be fundamentally different from non-blast-related TBIs in terms of symptoms and how the injury develops and progresses. All right, this is a good one here. This is from April 2018, the Wall Street Journal. Never heard of that one? All right. Weapons training likely causes brain injury in troops, study says. Gauges worn on troops' helmets and body armor register substantial blasts in combat and in training. Look at the picture they use. Who do they use as the example? They use a mortar crew. So, again, they hit them the point, even though a lot of these science articles aren't really mortar-centric, the mortar crews easily qualify in being the top members of this club. Okay. All right. U.S. Marines launch a mortar during joint exercise. Repeated use of such weapons in training could cause brain damage, a new study says. All right. Washington. Thousands of U.S. troops are likely suffering traumatic brain injury, not just from battlefield explosions, but from repeated exposure to trauma while training on their own weapons, according to a new study. Service members, even those who may not have seen combat but specialize in using high explosives or weapons such as rocket launchers, could have lasting brain damage from the pounding on their necks and heads, researchers at the Center for New American Security said in a report released Monday. Now, we have this report, and we're going to go over it in more detail once we get all this stuff. Okay, we're going to go over what it summarizes and the article and the science it uses to come to its conclusions. So this is really the report that got a lot of eyeballs and attention going towards this. Okay. The Defense Think Tank is a non-profit organization funded by the federal government and public and private sector donors. It's analogous to people getting hits to the head in sports playing football or boxing, a senior fellow at the center, said Paul Shar, who's one of the authors of the report. This is not really well understood. The primary blast effects on the brain, exactly how it affects the brain is unclear, but the fact that it is having some kind of negative effect is now being shown. The military sporadically has used blast gauges, small devices worn on troops' helmets or body armor, to better understand the effects of explosions in combat. Researchers began to notice that these gauges weren't just registering substantial blasts in combat, but in training too. Now, this is what I want members of my group to pay attention to here too. Representatives from a number of veterans advocacy organizations, including those who help vets with disability claims, said they haven't noticed vets complaining. They have not noticed vets complaining about the problem or making claims to the Department of Defense for compensation on the matter. Why not? Because the science hasn't been available to us till now. That could be because there isn't a major problem, or because vets don't yet realize the problem. Here we are. It took time for those affected to recognize the long-term effects of Agent Orange on their health. Okay, next article. MilitaryTimes.com, May 2018. Shoulder-fired weapons can cause traumatic brain injuries. Study finds military personnel who have trained with heavy weaponry may have been exposed to blasts that cause traumatic brain injury, a newly published study claims. All right, emerging evidence presented in a May Center for New American Study report. Again, that's the report that we're going to go over. Shows that these weapons cause exposes service members to overpressure of the brain. The effect when a blast wave traveling faster than the speed of sound causes a ripple of the skull, generating additional pressure on the cerebrum. It was discovered in 2009 that military doctors rarely even addressed head injuries that didn't show bleeding or penetration of the skull. The center found. Muddling the diagnostic process even further is that only the worst cases of TBI show up on most exams. TBI caused by blast waves is unlikely to appear at all. It's negative on imaging, so it may not show up on X-rays, MRIs, or CT scans. Many injured soldiers do not initially realize that they have suffered an injury or experience immediate symptoms. The cumulative effect of repeated low-level blast exposure also complicates injury recognition, as TBI symptoms can manifest at a later point despite the absence of a singular contributing event. Study and former Army Ranger Paul Scharr told NPR that extensive exposure to particular weapons over the course of military career might have some subtle and insidious long-term effect that doesn't materialize until later. Those long-term effects can include memory, attention, emotional, and mood problems that can last over a year, the report said. The likelihood of developing an anxiety disorder, insomnia, fatigue, dizziness, irritability, headache, or seizures, all symptoms that can be confused for PTSD, also increases. So this is where we're going to hit on post-concussion syndrome. Another Military Times, this one's about a year and a half later, December 2019. Could multiple brain injuries be affecting good order and discipline? The Pentagon wants to find out. The Defense Department has a mandate to look into the consequences of troops' exposures of blasts from shoulder-fired weapons after a 2018 study suggested that repeated impact can cause traumatic brain injuries and all the consequences that go along with them. So what this does is that the Department of Defense is acknowledging that it's a problem enough that could be affecting battlefield decisions. Last year, the Center for New American Security released a report finding that shoulder-fired weapons cause small brain injuries, which can compound over time. These insidious kinds of injuries aren't just medical readiness issue, Horton said, but could affect how troops operate in combat. This is a press release here from an Iowa Republican senator named Joni Ernst. And she's been aware of the problems that's been presented to her because of this 2018 report. And they're creating, her and Senator Warren are creating legislature to look further into the problem and develop a way for present soldiers to be able to track the amounts and quantity of exposures that they have in order to see what risk they have for traumatic brain injury. During combat, so this is from her office's press release, May 2019. During combat and training, many of our men and women in uniform are exposed to blasts which can lead to conditions like traumatic brain injury. We know that service members exposed to blasts during combat and training later experience long-term brain injury, said Senator Warren. Blast overpressure. The pressure caused from a severe shock wave causes harm to the brain, not just by moving the brain around the skull, but also by acutely damaging individual brain cells. Exposure to blast pressure may result not only from battlefield IEDs, but also from smaller concussive events such as firing artillery and other heavy caliber weapons, which military personnel may do multiple times a day over multiple days at a time while training to use these weapons. Here's another article that came out in 2018. This one isn't necessarily a press release. It's more of like a summary of a meeting that the minds behind this science had. Okay, so a lot of the authors of the articles that were used to establish this information are posing their stuff in this article here. And this is by the RAND Corporation, which is fairly large. The 7th Annual Department of Defense State of the Science Meeting. The neurological effects of repeated exposure to military occupational blast. Implications for prevention and health. So again, they're recognizing it's a problem and we need to talk about it. This is the summary. I won't get into the whole report, but this is basically the summary. I put this in the press releases because it's somewhere between a science article and a press release. There have been growing concern over the potential for subconcussive neurological injury after repeated low-level military occupational blast (MOB) exposures. Examples include heavy weapon and munition training. For example, artillery, recoilless rifles, shoulder-mounted rockets, and activities such as breaching. Also mortars. Remember, mortars are a big member of that club as well. All right. The potential neurological effects of low-level overpressure. A number of studies in rats and mice suggest that the cognitive domain may be particularly sensitive to low-level blast. So let's hit that again. The cognitive domain may be particularly sensitive to low-level blast. In these animal studies, blast exposures ranging from 3 to 10 psi were associated with reduced learning or cognition persisting up to 30 days. So we'll show again that mortars are easily within this or sometimes exceeding that. Here's another interesting article. Blast-induced PTSD. All right. Greg Elder from VA. Blast exposure without other psychological trauma can induce a PTSD-like state. Moderate to severe TBI is recognizable by cognitive defects, but mild TBI and PTSD have overlapping symptoms. So basically, we'll sum it up here. Occupational blast overpressure exists and is a problem. It can cause concussion-like injuries. 4 psi is the safe limit. Mortars easily exceed it. And over a career, they can have a high exposures. And these exposures have a cumulative effect. So the more you have, the worse it gets. And so far, there haven't been any really VA compensation claims or benefit claims for soldiers because it hasn't been reported, because I believe they're unaware of it. Most of this information comes from one report, which we're going to cover here in the next topic, and this is the study. Center for a New American Security, which we mentioned a little earlier in those press releases. Okay, so this is it right here. Center for New American Security is a DC think tank that specializes in military type stuff, and this is the May 2018 release date of it. Okay, so let's jump in, shall we? So what we have here is the key findings, the executive summary of this report. And basically it's broken into two different parts here. We have the cause and the effect. So what's happening and what they propose DOD and the Army should do about it in future testing and technology and et cetera, et cetera. So, but what I'm going to focus on here is the cause and how it relates to mortar crews and neurologically related and auditorily related symptoms. Okay. All right, so first, I have it broke down here into 3 categories. We're going to hit each category at a time. We're going to go into the science behind each summary bullet point that they've come up with. Okay, I'm not going to give commentary. We need to keep it moving pretty smoothly, so I'm just going to highlight the abstracts and read along the abstracts and let the science speak for itself. Okay. Category A here. Emerging evidence suggests that service members may be exposed to high levels of blast overpressure, the pressure wave that comes from explosions when firing heavy weapons such as the Carl Gustaf recoilless rifle, even in training. Okay? So again, that talks about what we mentioned earlier in the press releases and how that relates. So here's the scientific articles that make up the basis of their conclusion there. Okay, so repetitive blast exposure and brain injury. Introduction. Blast overpressure, an occupational hazard, is a significant cause of brain injury. This paper will first review scientific evidence that repetitive blast exposure harms the brain. Acute symptoms of mild TBI include headaches, dizziness, fatigue, irritability, confusion, memory problems, and sleep disturbances. In some cases, blast exposure can harm the brain without producing any obvious acute symptoms. Blast-related symptoms can surface much later on. I'm just going to note here, post-concussive syndrome. Okay. All right. The investigators concluded that this pattern of damage may be specific to blast and that it may explain persistent neuropsychiatric symptoms of blast TBI. In a study of 134 veterans, Robinson and colleagues found that close-range blast exposure was associated with altered brain connectivity, even when the blast exposure did not result in concussion symptoms at the time. They concluded that the blast exposure may induce subclinical brain injury and contribute to the onset of PTSD in a combat environment. Blast overpressure is an occupational hazard that injures the brain. If we fail to take steps to reduce exposures, it presents a significant liability for the VA system. An evaluation of blast gauges in the Australian Defence Force. This is from July 2015. The results. The trial identified and documented that personnel are exposed to potentially harmful blasts in operational and non-operational combat-related activities, with the latter being more frequent. Non-operational meaning training events. Okay? Those are the results. Earlier we talked about this 4 PSI. That's the safe limit established by the Army and Department of Defense for overpressure exposure to soldiers. These devices have 3 detections. A green light indicates exposures to a pressure of 0 to 4, and red, amber 4 to 16, and red above 16. Okay. The results immediately after the start of the trial, there was a major change in force posture and subsequent operations conducted by the Australian troops, which resulted in a significant reduction in exposure to the risk of blast events. So they went from a combat role to some other kind of role. Thus, the data presented from blast events is almost all related to training activities. For example, firing mortars, which is what we're all talking about here, and detonating explosive charges to breach doors. Next in the study, they show this table. This is the total number of events recorded while they were doing this trial. 2,417 low-level blast overpressure events. Okay. Of those 2,417, 2,381 registered above the safe limit. The trial identified and documented that personnel are exposed to potentially harmful blasts in operation and non-operational combat-related activities, with the later being much more frequent, which we hit on in the results. Occupational overpressure exposure of breachers and military personnel. Okay, the data were collected using the black box biometrics blast gauge. The results of these studies indicate that the current minimum safe distance calculations are often inaccurate for both indoor and outdoor breaching scenarios, as true environmental exposures can consistently exceed 4 psi incident safe threshold prescribed by U.S. Army doctrine. As both the artillery As both the artillery and mortar crews commonly fire hundreds of rounds during a single training session, they are also likely to receive high cumulative exposures. All right. Introduction. In 2008, a symptom complex associated with chronic exposure to repetitive blast, low-level blast, LLB, labeled by the affected population as breacher's brain, was independently reported by military medical providers from multiple countries. Breacher's brain is a complex of subjective symptoms, including but not limited to headache, fatigue, a slowed thought process, and increase in memory difficulties, effects which are similar to sports concussion or also post-concussive syndrome. The U.S. Army implements a 4 psi incident overpressure exposure limit based on the threshold for gross injury to the human eardrum. In both training and operations, military and law enforcement personnel are repeatedly exposed to blast events ranging from small arms to explosives. The results presented herein demonstrate the wide range of overpressure and impulse exposures among these groups. And here we have the table for the 120 firings. So you can see here very frequently those levels are surpassed repetitively and they have a cumulative effect. It is possible that the pressure waves or environmental reflections enter the back of the Humvee, or in our case I'm going to show you the armored vehicle, and are amplified within the confined space, resulting in an increased peak pressure, overpressure exposure. Additionally, by containing the wave in the back of the vehicle, the duration of the exposure is increased, which results in increased impulse exposure. So in general, the summation of this whole report, in general, the data from multiple sites demonstrate that operator exposure is affected by proximity to the overpressure source as well as the environment of the operator during the exposure. Enclosed spaces and reflective surfaces present the greatest risk of operators receiving increased overpressure exposure. MilitaryAnalysisNetwork.com. And we're talking about the 120 millimeter mortar. 120 millimeter mortar, or the M120 mortar, when fired, especially in the carrier configuration, produces a blast overpressure impulse noise level in excess of allowable limits. From 1997, and this is from the Department of Defense, blast overpressure studies and non-auditory damage risk assessment for simulated muzzle blast from a 120 millimeter mortar system. All right. Official stuff. All right, background. The impulse noise produced by Army weapons is called blast overpressure, the change in air pressure that occurs as a result of an explosion. For the purpose of this study, BOP refers to overpressure experienced by a crew member of a mortar or artillery piece when that weapon is fired. As such, blast overpressure is an expected part of the training environment of many soldiers and is considered an occupational medicine concern. So we know it can be damaging to soldiers. The soldier is exposed to blast overpressure in peacetime and in war. Another important factor is crew proximity to the muzzle. This is critical for mortars, where the crew may be within a meter or less of the blast source. Scientific technical review from 2016 called Shockwave Overpressure of Propellant Gases Around the Mortar. Introduction. As a consequence, there is the occurrence of the greater overpressure around the weapon, which is particularly emphasized at the mortar, where the firing operator or the gunner is in the vicinity of the weapon during the procedure of loading and firing. The overpressure at the gunner's position is 3-point bar, which requires the use of protective equipment and imposes the need of reducing the overpressure, because the overpressure of 3 bar and more is considered to be one that may cause issues and disturbance of mortar crew. one of the things we want to hit home here is the crew's proximity to the blast. So you see right here, here's the muzzle. Round goes off right here. You can see how close these guys are. You see the blast is such that way over here in the background, it's kicking up dust on these sandbags and stuff over here. Here in this photo, here's the blast itself. This is the actual, you can see the curve of the overpressure right here. Okay, and this is a soldier's head. This is the gunner's head right here. Okay, blast less than a foot away really. And this is the assistant gunner. And he's maybe a meter away grabbing another round. Again, blast coming out the muzzle, and there's the soldier's proximity to it. Again, we have, this just went off, you can't tell, but there's some smoke there. You see the back of this guy's head. There's nothing protecting the back of his head from the exposure of the blast, which is easily less than a meter away. The tests when they did these were what's called ground mounted. The mortar is in a ground mounted configuration. So it's on the ground deployed by the mortar crew. So here we got a picture by picture process of the round firing. So they just dropped the round, it hasn't gone off yet. And there you can see by the dust there that the round has just gone off. There's a little bit of smoke right here, so it's just launched. And then a split second later, the camera goes out of focus. As you can see, the dust in here is disrupted as the camera is wobbling. So it's affected way back here by the pressure of the blast coming back this way. Here we have another sequence of photos, and this one, you can see he just fired the mortar, and here's the first smoke of it going off. Now you can see out here in front the disruption of the dust and things getting kicked up as the overpressure impacts the ground around the mortar in this direction. But the unique thing about this one is in this direction over here, there's no disruption of any dust or anything. So this overpressure that's coming backwards away from the mortar is now all being contained inside that this box right here. This mortar's going off, and you can see the effect of the overpressure. It's knocking the dust off of this guy's sleeve, off of this guy's back. It's even knocking the dust off of the tires and front grille of this truck over here. And look how it affects the dust on the back, on the dirt. Now, that's the pressure wave hitting the ground enough such that it disrupts the dirt like that. Now all this energy coming back this way that you see there in the armored version is all contained inside that box.
I've created a little video that I think it's important to include visual evidence, so you can kind of visually see what I'm talking about. Pointing it out in a picture here is one thing, but we got some video here, and I think it'll settle the case of anybody arguing that mortars are not in this class of soldiers that are exposed to these high levels, which isn't true. Mortars are probably among the highest soldiers that are exposed to blast overpressure as an occupational risk.
Fire! Jesus fucking Christ.
Now we have the video and we have the science behind it to prove what it's doing and the effects it has. Okay, so we've covered subject A. Emerging evidence suggests that service members may be exposed to high levels of blast overpressure when firing heavy weapons, such as the Carl Gustav recoilless rifle, even in training. We've also showed that mortars are members of this club and also receive high levels of cumulative blast exposures in their career. So the next key finding in this summary: Department of Defense studies have demonstrated that some service members experience cognitive deficits in delayed verbal memory, visual spatial memory, and executive function after firing weapons, even within allowable limits. This next part, talking about the science of how the brain is affected, basically down to a molecular level, is pretty sobering. Is a 2017 article called Perspectives on Repeated Low-Level Blast and the Measurement of Neurotrauma in Humans as an Occupational Exposure Risk. In survey results, headache, difficulty sleeping, irritability, cognitive impairment, and a variety of other symptoms consistent with post-concussive syndrome have been reported by those exposed to blast, and there was positive correlation between degree of blast exposure and degree of symptomology. The weight of available evidence points to an association between repeated blast and neurologic dysfunction. Survey results suggesting a neurologic effect from repeated low-level blasts were consistent with an anecdotal reporting of blast effects. This is March 2017. Development of a portable tool for screening neuromotor sequelae from repetitive low-level blast exposure. The ACWalker app revealed that there are changes in neuromotor functioning after low-level blast exposure. These data suggest that neurocognitive and neuromotor decline can occur after repeated low-level blast exposure. A significant number of military personnel are exposed to subclinical head perturbations as a result of blast exposure associated with training. Repeated low-level blast exposure can lead to concurrent neurocognitive and neuromotor decline, suggesting that the effect of repeated low-level blast exposure on neuromotor control lasts less than 72 to 96 hours. However, the cumulative effect of chronic exposure to repeated low-level blast exposure remains an empirical question. We showed that neuromotor decline accompanied neurocognitive decline in a subset of participants who were repeatedly exposed to low-level blasts from firing heavy weapons. Functioning. Next article. This is 2019, very recent. Acute and chronic molecular signatures associated symptoms of blast exposure in military breachers. There's Common Mori and this other guy Carr. You'll see his name a lot. The primary findings of our study suggest that DNA methylation and gene expression are modulated by blast exposure in military personnel after blast exposure training programs. We show that high cumulative blast exposure history alters DNA methylation patterns relative to subjects in lower blast exposure throughout their military career. Most notably, these DNA methylation changes associated with cumulative exposures generally conferred functional changes in gene expression. This finding, associating high lifetime cumulative blast exposure to changes in PAX8 and antisense transcript methylation and its respective associations with changes in deep sleep duration. PAX8 antisense is a messenger RNA. Okay, it's important because sleep disturbances are reported in military warfighters in both active duty and post-deployment settings. Sleep disturbances lead to immediate impairments in cognition and alertness, potentially resulting in accidents or death, and are also associated with mental health outcomes, including post-traumatic stress disorder, depression, and in the military populations. Our DNA methylation findings further associate the effects of blast overpressure exposure with biological molecular perturbations, potentially resulting in sleep dysregulation in our military warfighters. It is a brain-related proteins as serum biomarkers of acute subconcussive blast overpressure exposure, a cohort study of military personnel. This is August 2019, not even a year ago. So this is all new science. Repeated exposure to blast overpressure remains a major cause of adverse health for military personnel who, as a consequence, are at a higher risk for neurodegenerative disease and suicide. But basically it ends up saying that participants reported experiencing headaches, dizziness, and taking longer to think. Dizziness was associated with reaction time decrements, GFAP, and NFL suppression, as well as a peptide evaluation. Low levels of exposure are linked to acute reduction in operational performance, indicated in part by decrement in reaction time. Repetitive exposure has been linked to a complex array of symptoms, including headache, tinnitus, fatigue, dizziness, symptom complex that has been termed breacher's brain, also known as post-concussion syndrome. Here we're talking about the levels that they used in this study, and I highlighted it to show you that the levels involved in this study, again, referring back to that Kawamori table, were all within the levels that are received commonly by mortar crews. Discussion. However, mass spectrometer-based proteomics of serum revealed peptides of proteins that were specifically associated with the degree of PTSD or post-concussive syndrome symptomology among veterans who suffered from mild TBI. Overall, this study is the first to show dysregulation of blood biomarkers, specifically this one, are aligned with symptomology that is common among participants exposed to blast overpressure. Conclusions. Mild, moderate blast exposure is associated with acute elevation of serum peptides, a slight increase of tau, but a reduction of GFAP and NFL. This is from February 2020 research study. That's just a couple months ago. A moderate blast exposure results in dysregulated gene network activity related to cell death, survival, structure, and metabolism. Walter Carr, again, another subject matter expert at Walter Reed. Following moderate blast exposure. 5 gene networks were dysregulated, specifically 2 highly significant networks, number 1 being cell death and survival, and 2 being cell structure and function. Moderate blast exposure induced significant gene expression changes, including gene networks involved in cell death and survival, and cellular development and function. The present findings may have implications for understanding blast exposure pathology and subsequent recovery efforts. Results of RNA sequence analysis demonstrated significantly dysregulated gene activity changes following moderate blast exposure. Okay. Discussion. Activity changes in 2 gene networks were found after moderate blast exposure in military personnel engaged in training. Differentially regulated networks after blast included cell death and survival, cell structure function, and development. Genes within these 2 networks relate to ubiquitization, nonsense-mediated decay, apoptosis, as well as activity related to ribosomes, mitochondria, and inflammation. Findings provide novel insights for understanding the biological changes that occur following blast. Which for some individuals may result in biological changes that may increase their risk for neurological behavioral symptoms and deficits. Conclusion. The initial findings reported here show that there are robust gene activity changes following a moderate blast exposure in a sample of military personnel. This one's from September 2019. Walter Carr again from Walter Reed. Neurocognitive performance deficits related to immediate and acute blast overpressure exposure. Overall, this study provides evidence that increasing blast overpressure, defined as peak overpressure experienced in a training day, can lead to transient degradations in neurocognitive performance, as seen on the Dana PRT subtask, which may generalize to other capabilities. Accumulating evidence suggests that blast exposure can result in negative effects on the brain in absence of medically diagnosable injury. The effects of these subconcussive blast exposures are gaining attention in research and military communities, concentrating on repeated exposures, deteriorating performance, and long-term health consequences. Importantly, studies finding deteriorated performance from subconcussive overpressure exposure are not limited to preclinical models. Negative effects are observed in naturalistic observation studies with human subjects. Table showing the PSI pressure levels that they did, and these are all within range of what a heavy mortar does in a typical training mission. Discussion. Results here showed that overpressure exposure can negatively affect neurocognitive performance. Duration of service and occupational exposure to blast have been demonstrated to affect cognition. In sum, this work provides evidence not only for the maintenance of the soldier health long term, but for the safety of personnel in harm's way. Knowing that neurocognitive performance related to decision making and reaction time can be compromised by blast exceeding certain thresholds for peak and cumulative pressure provides pertinent information for decision making. Next study, April 2020, last month. Last month. Assessing a blast-related biomarker in an operational community. Glial fibrillary acidic protein in experienced breachers. Okay. Over the course of a career, these mild blast exposures may have cumulative effects such as headache or psychological or cognitive changes, some of which may be long-lasting. This indicates the reduction in GFAP levels may be due to the service member's cumulative exposure during the entire training period and not just the large blast exposure experienced on day 7. Further, duration of service and cumulative pressure for the training period were positively correlated. These findings indicate that those personnel who have longer duration of service may be in positions of leadership and thus in a position to be exposed to more cumulative pressure throughout training day. Period. Excellent. Okay. All right, so that concludes the second part of the executive summary back here that from the original article. DoD studies have demonstrated that service members experience cognitive deficits in delayed verbal memory, visual, spatial memory, and executive functioning after firing heavy weapons, even within allowable limits. All right, next, what we're going to do is we're going to cover the third and final key finding that relates to the mortars and service connection. Department of Defense studies have also found higher rates of concussion and post-concussion associated symptoms among individuals with a history of prolonged exposure to low-level blasts from breaching and shoulder-fired weapons. Okay, so we'll flip back on here to category C. Okay, this is a December 2008 article. Neuropathology and pressure in the pig brain resulting from low impulse noise exposure. Military personnel are exposed to occupational levels of blast overpressure during training. This study addresses the effect of multiple blast exposure as commonly seen in training and in combat. Discussion. The neuropathology described in our study showed significant levels of small hemorrhages, predominantly in the posterior parts of the brains. Similar post-mortem histological findings were noted in the brains of soldiers who died after exposure to blast without evidence of external injuries. The results show that a blast overpressure pulse in air or water is transmitted into the brain, possibly directly through skin and skull bone, or possibly via the nasal and orbital cavities. This study is the first to report brain injury from occupational levels of blast in a large animal model. 2014, relation of repeated low-level blast exposure with symptomology similar to concussion. Walter Carr from Walter Reed. The results. Findings suggest that number and severity of symptoms increase with history of chronic blast exposure, and that symptoms can interfere with daily activity. The results of this survey indicate that breachers not only reported more symptoms related to post-concussive syndrome than non-breachers, but also rated them as being more severe and more interfering with daily activity. The results also support the hypothesis that there is a positive relation between the amount of blast exposure and reported symptoms. Repeated low-level blast from breaching as well as blast from shoulder-fired weapons is demonstrated in these results as potential occupational medicine concerns. Post-concussive syndrome may be present in cases in which these symptoms associated with breaching and other repeated low-level blast exposures are prolonged. Although the exposure levels are low yield for any individual blast, unlike IED blast, this survey suggests that there is indeed a cumulative effect associated with these repeated blast exposures. This survey suggests that such efforts are not limited to breaching blasts, but extend to other sources of repeated blast exposures, such as those experienced by explosive ordnance disposal technicians, artillery, and mortar personnel. Mortars, that's us. This next topic here is going to be kind of a tangent, a subcategory, and what we're talking about is how these blast overpressures, exposures, especially concerning mortars, affect the cerebellum and the role that the cerebellum plays and the deficits that can result from it not working properly. Okay, so a little subcategory here, a couple of research articles, and then we'll get back on to the other topic, okay? All right. Repetitive blast exposure in mice and combat veterans causes persistent cerebellar dysfunction. This is January 2016. Together, these results argue that the cerebellum is vulnerable to repetitive mild TBI in both mice and veterans. In landmark neuropathological studies, Corsellis and colleagues mapped the Purkinje cell loss in former boxers and found that an anatomical pattern of loss that was strikingly similar to our findings in blast-exposed mice. The neuroanatomical correspondence between blast-exposed mice and veterans with repetitive blast-related mild TBIs or former boxers with impact-related mild TBIs raises interesting questions about the mechanisms by which blast injures the cerebellum. Thus, it is possible that the cerebellar white matter and Purkinje cell abnormalities observed in our study could disrupt cerebellar cortical connections and thereby contribute to chronic behavioral and post-concussive symptoms that are frequently observed in this population. This is a study here named the Cerebellum and Cognition from April 2018. What the cerebellum does to sensory, motor, and vestibular control, it also does to cognition, emotion, and autonomic function. Conclusion. There is now more holistic and realistic view of the cerebellum and its necessary and unique contribution as an integral node in the distributed neural circuits subserving human behavior across all domains. Consensus paper, the cerebellum's role in movement and cognition. These technical improvements have allowed for repeated demonstrations that the cerebellum plays important roles in both motor and non-motor functions. The general consensus no longer concerns whether or not the cerebellum plays a role in cognition, but instead concerns how the cerebellum contributes to both movement and thought. A total of 14 experts contributed to this 12 manuscript consensus paper on the topic of the role of the cerebellum in movement and cognition. First, there is unanimous agreement that the cerebellum plays a role in both movement and cognition. All right, and here's where I want to point out where we're focusing on the cerebellum a little bit and why it relates to mortars. So, start of the procedure when you fire a mortar is to duck away from the blast. So, as you can see here in these images, here's the muzzle of the mortar. Okay, about a meter away are the back of these soldiers' heads. Now you can see by this one right here, he has no protection on the back of the bottom of his skull, and the top of his spine has no protection from the blast overpressure right here. Here's another good example right here. So going down to this kid right here, there's a blast hitting right under his helmet on the bottom of his skull and the base of his neck. Here again, bottom of the skull, top of the neck. Look how close these guys are to this blast right here. I mean, he's that close. So the blast is hitting the back of his. The reason I'm bringing it up is you can see here plainly that the base of the skull where the cerebellum meets the top of the spinal cord is incredibly sensitive to blast, and it can have wide-ranging peripheral damaging effects, and there's no protection from blast overpressure firing mortars with current SOP. We see here, this is an MRI of the brain. This is the region we're talking about. So base of the skull, top of the spine. A lot of important activity goes back and forth in that junction. So if these are damaged and things aren't firing right here, it's going to have peripheral effects everywhere else. These are the parts of the brain that are particularly damaged by blast injury, the cerebellum and the hippocampus. So we're focusing on the cerebellum here, the bottom of the skull and the top of the spine as it relates to mortars. So mortars are unique in that no other military occupation has this kind of technique where they turn away and expose the back of their neck to the blast, as far as I'm aware. So that puts us in a unique position. You compound that to the proximity to the muzzle of the blast going off. Sometimes, and it's inside a iron box service. This is from May 2016. Repeated low-level blast exposure, a descriptive human studies subject study by Walter Reed. The observed changes yield descriptive evidence for potential neurological alterations in the subset of individuals with occupational history of repetitive blast exposure. The results observed, however, did yield a description suggestive of blast-induced impairment in selected domains of cognition among individuals subject to sustained repetitive blast exposure. The findings suggest that an individual's sensitivity to blast may be enhanced after multiple exposures. All right, from June 2017. Repeated low-intensity blast exposure is associated with damaged endothelial glycolax and downstream behavioral deficits. Forgive me on that one. Military personnel experience repeated low-intensity blast exposure during training and/or combat, often resulting in mild TBI. By definition, mild TBI patients lack overt signs of trauma, such as hemorrhage or swelling. The salient finding from this study is that damage to the vascular endothelial glycocalyx is associated with cognitive impairment following exposure to repeated low-intensity blast. These results show that blast exposure damages the vasculature and impairs cognition at lower intensities than those needed to damage the brain parenchyma, which is functional tissue of the brain. Additionally, this study is the first to demonstrate the novel finding that glycocalyx integrity is associated with downstream cognitive performance. Taken together, these findings identify the endothelial glycocalyx as a discrete component of the brain vasculature damaged by low-intensity blast exposures, which is associated with downstream behavioral effects. Repeated low-intensity blast exposures at intensities described here are frequently encountered during training or combat operations. This is July 2019, not even a year ago. Repeated low-level blast overpressure leads to endovascular disruption and alterations of TDP43 piezo2 in a rat model of blast TBI. Evidence linking repeated low-level blast overpressure exposure in operational and training environments with neurocognitive decline, neuroinflammation, and neurodegeneration processes has prompted concern over the cumulative deleterious effects of repeated blast exposure on the brains of service members. Repetitive exposure to low-level primary blast may cause symptoms subclinical similar to those seen in mild traumatic brain injury, with progressive vascular and cellular changes, which could contribute to neurodegeneration. At the cellular level, the mechanical force associated with blast exposure can cause cellular perturbations in the brain, leading to secondary injury. Lastly, piezo2 has been shown to be dysregulated following blast exposure and was here observed to increase after multiple blasts of moderate magnitude, indicating that blast may cause a change in sensitivity to mechanical stimuli in the brain and may contribute to cellular injury. In addition to blast injury sustained during combat, military and law enforcement personnel who participate in training with explosives such as breaching and heavy weapon systems are exposed to multiple low-level blast exposures throughout training. There is evidence that repetitive blast exposure leads to acute chronic symptoms that mimic those seen following mild TBI. Low-level blast exposure can lead to symptomology similar to that seen in mild TBI, including headache, irritability, and cognitive deficits. Due to the high incidence of low-level blast exposure in military personnel and in related training, it is important to understand how repeated low-level blast exposure can lead to acute and potentially chronic neurological deficits. Discussion. In this study, we showed that blast overpressure exposure has neuropathological effects which depend upon intensity, orientation, and frequency of blast exposure. Blast overpressure exposure can cause alterations in blood-brain barrier structure. Personnel such as breachers or heavy weapon system operators are exposed to many low-level blasts over an extended period of time. All right. Another August 2019. The role of very low level blast, overpressure, and symptomology. There's Kamimori again. This work was prompted by reports of symptomology such as headache, nausea, slowed reaction time and balance, hearing complications among personnel undergoing frequent exposures to low overpressure accompanied by high acoustic pressures. We demonstrate that low-level repeated overpressure exposure can result in transient symptomology that overlaps with subconcussive-like effects. These symptoms are sometimes referred to as breacher's brain, which I think is synonymous with post-concussion syndrome. The subclinical effects of blast exposure, collectively referred to as breacher's brain, include symptomology such as sleep The subclinical effects of blast exposure, collectively referred to as breacher's brain, include symptomology such as sleep disturbances, slow reaction time or long think, and nausea, and are thought to be the consequences of brain perturbations. These underlying perturbations are being investigated as part of a growing body of research focused on blast exposure. In addition, the weapon systems can yield high acoustic signatures that have effects not only on hearing, but also systemic equilibrium, organ damage, and other negative consequences. Investigations into acoustics note that virtually all common man portable musicians fielded by NATO members produced acoustic signatures between 145 and 190 decibels. The high levels of acoustic exposure commonly resulting from these musicians place users at high risk for acoustic damage. Taking the findings from blast, acoustic, and personal assessments in total, results indicate that acoustic pressure, even when combined with overpressure exposure, has associated symptomologies that manifest like breacher's brain. We found that significant acoustic exposure with corresponding low overpressure exposure during military training exercises that may contribute to breacher's brain-like symptoms in instructors. And that measured acoustic signatures are substantial despite current personnel protective equipment usage. This is another 2019 article. Blast exposure and risk of recurrent occupational overpressure exposure predict deployment TBIs. Blast exposure and recurrent occupational overpressure exposure were independently associated with mild TBIs, and Marines with both blast exposure during deployment and occupational exposure were especially likely to sustain a mild TBI. This suggests that occupational overpressure heightens the risk of mild TBI following blast. Ongoing research is examining the severity, symptomology, and sequelae of TBIs as a function of occupational overpressure exposure. Explosives, rocket-propelled grenades, shoulder-fired rockets, 50 caliber weapons, mortars, artillery, and some breaching rounds have all been shown to generate significant levels of overpressure exposure. Discussion. We hypothesized that blast exposure would be more strongly predictive of mild TBI for Marines working in occupations characterized as high levels of occupational exposure. Rope. Results were consistent with these hypotheses. Specifically, blast exposure and occupational risk were both independently and jointly associated with the likelihood of probable mild TBI during deployment. Taken together, these results suggest that while blast exposure and occupational risk are both independently associated with mild TBIs, Marines are significantly more likely to sustain a probable mild TBI during deployment than when the two co-occur. So that's pretty much the science behind these three main talking points here. Again, we're going to hit them again one more time. The key findings of this executive or this report here, Protecting Warfighters from Blast Injury, from the Center of New American Security, May 2018. The key findings in their summary. Emerging evidence suggests that service members may be exposed to high levels of blast overpressure, the pressure wave that comes from explosions when firing heavy weapons such as a Carl Gustav recoilless rifle, even in training. We covered the science behind that. DoD studies have demonstrated that some service members experience cognitive deficits, delayed verbal memory, visual spatial memory, and executive function after firing heavy weapons, even within allowable limits. So we covered that in the science, hitting that one. And lastly, DoD studies have also found higher rates of concussion and post-concussion associated symptoms among individuals with a history of prolonged exposure to low-level blasts from breaching and shoulder-fired weapons.
Well, thanks for getting through that with me. I'm sure that was as hard for you as it was for me. A lot of that's way above my learning. I'm not a medical professional or scientist or by any means. I'm simply self-taught by what I've done through my own research. So forgive the sloppiness of the pronunciation. All right. So in closing, I want to sum up with a couple things. As I mentioned in my introduction, I'm the founder of a Facebook group that is centric to veterans who are mortarmen while they were in service, exposed to blast overpressures, and also think that they have some kind of relation to their current health issues. There's also another 11 Charlie, which is the MOS nomenclature for mortarmen, Facebook group, which has over 7,000 members. And on both of those groups, a poll was conducted. And the poll basically was looking to know what percentage of the group reported multiple chronic symptoms related to post-concussive syndrome or auditory issues. The poll results basically told us that the majority of the members of the group reported 3 or 4 or more chronic symptoms of post-concussion syndrome and auditory problems. In fact, it was a very small minority that reported no health issues at all. So from that, we know that this is a real problem, and you'll see from these lay statements I'm about to show you from group members commenting and messaging that this is a real issue, and that a lot of soldiers are waking up, veterans are waking up to the discovery that a lot of the issues that they've had and not understood why they're having them now may have an explanation, and the science shows that there is a clear link between the two. So in sum, the VA says that service connection may be granted for a disability which began in military service or was caused by some event or experience in service. Okay, so what we know now is that the science and media, the videos and photos show clear connection to veterans with chronic post-concussive syndrome symptoms and neurological degenerative disorders associated with it, and auditory problems as well. So it's clear. The clear, simple, undeniable, and logical conclusion is that occupational exposure to low-level blast exposure, firing heavy mortars, is connected to veterans with chronic post-concussive symptoms and similar and associated disorders and auditory health issues as well. Thank you for watching. Please check out our Facebook group, C3M, Cohort of Chronically Concussed Mortarmen, on Facebook, and please share and don't forget to watch the the 10-minute video, Occupational Exposure to Mild Blast Overpressure Firing Heavy Mortars. Really, again, it shows the visualization of all this science, and it's pretty profound as well. My name's Todd Strader. You can contact me at c3m.fdc@gmail.com. Once again, thank you for watching, and please share this with anybody you think it might be relevant to or could benefit from this knowledge.